Hello, my name is Bret. This is my channel on YouTube, Twitch, Periscope, all those things. And I'm live on the internet every Thursday, so thank you for being here. I talk about containers, Docker, Kubernetes, you know the drill. Most of you have been here before. We're talking in chat, and I have a little bit of an agenda. I have no practiced stuff, but if we get a chance and there's not a lot of questions, which there's always a lot of questions, but if we don't get a lot of those questions, then I might play around with some Swarm storage stuff that I have no idea what I'm doing with. But yeah, so let's get into it. Let me know. I messed a lot with my audio this week, and I did some testing, but let me know if the audio is good. I've got some background chill beats going on this week because that's the mood I'm in. And yeah, I'm here to chit chat and hopefully have some answers for you. So let's do it. And of course, Biker shows up before we even start streaming with the most technical question of the day, talking about a Windows.NET container. So it's a Windows container, not a Linux container, and Docker Swarm secret permissions inside of a container, and that it's not working. And I can tell you right off the bat that I have never troubleshooted a Swarm secret on a Windows container. I've certainly created them, but I'm never used the web.config file as a secret. So one of the challenges with a secret is that a secret has to be in a certain location. They're quite different on Windows than they are on Linux. In fact, they even had to, I think, wait around for a while for Microsoft to even implement the temporary file system so that they're not actually writing the secrets to disk. Because I don't know if this is still true, but the secrets had to be, initially, they were actually written on the host. And so they're actually in program files on the host on real disk and then just mounted into the container. So I don't know if that's still true. I haven't actually checked in a couple of years on that feature. I'm suspecting that it's still true and that it was a limitation of Windows. So I don't actually know. And I don't even have a Windows container that I could properly troubleshoot. So I'm probably not going to be able to help you with that, Biker. I do have a Windows host, Hyper-V machine. I would say the first thing you probably want to definitely do is have at least Windows Server 2019. But after that, I don't know. I don't even know if actually, because the secrets in Swarm and on Linux, they have to be in, I think, var run secrets. So I don't know on Windows if that's, obviously that doesn't exist, that path doesn't exist. So I don't know what the required location is on Windows, or if it's even allowed to be anywhere, because it's not really in tempfs. Let's see. Yeah, and I'm back on stereo today, and I got my hairs cut. I got the COVID hair cut, so hopefully it'll be a good week. Okay. Let's see. Next question. I think this was before. Yeah, I mean, Biker, in general, I have 0 clients that have ever deployed Windows containers. So the only experience I have on Windows containers is just learning for my own, edification. Everyone that I know that is on Windows, they are leaving Windows as is, and I have a couple of shops that do they do .NET stuff, but they're moving everything to .NET Core so they can use Linux servers. So I've not had any companies that are heavily interested in investing in Windows containers on Windows servers. I guess they're kind of writing off Windows servers for development purposes, and they might use it, for Active Directory and file services and all that, but for hosting web apps and .NET stuff, they are shifting to .NET Core on Linux. or just a completely different language that's going to be written somewhere else on a Linux server. Airpit or Arpit, if that's anything close to the pronunciation of your name. What should the best way of pushing some data zip files into persistent volumes? Should it be part of the Chef Ansible script? Should the application in the container initialize somehow itself somehow do it? Yes, actually, absolutely. If you have a container that when it starts up, it requires specific data in a volume to start, that should absolutely be part of an entry point script. I do not believe in containers that won't work until some other manual intervention inside that container has to happen through some other system. Like that, you already have that system. It's Docker, in the container. If you are only Kubernetes, then you might consider init containers inside of the Kubernetes pod. But I'm not actually even a fan of that, because then that means you have to come up with a different solution for local development, unless you're committed to developing in Kubernetes, which I am not a fan of. So even though entry point scripts may not be as much infrastructure as code as, and as operational kind of stuff as a YAML file that you might have for Chef or Puppet or Ansible or whatever, but I still think that entry point is the right way to go, because it's a standard that we've all sort of agreed upon for containers. It's kind of like Docker files. They're not the best formatting, and long run commands and Docker files kind of suck in terms of understanding them and maintaining them, but it's the best we got. So just comment the hell out of it in your Docker file, comment the hell out of the entry point script, comment, always describe what you're doing and why you're doing it, just like you would in code. And that's what I would do. All right, and I think I'm caught up on that. So let me get over here to the. Please update us on the remaining K8's mastery video lectures. So I'm in the middle of the storage section. It has been taking me a while, just due to the nature of everything between life, summer, living at the ocean front. I live near a beach, and life here slows down a little bit in the summer because that's how we like to do it. But I am actively working on that almost every day. It's just taking a little longer than usual. So I apologize for that, but that is the next section you can expect from me. I don't have a release date, but we've even been working on and making those videos better this time with a little more visualization, some more graphics and visuals. So that's actually taking me some time, because I'm creating a new process for how I'm going to do Visio-like diagrams in Keynote. And I was trying to use a bunch of different tools. I've tried Inkscape, Whimsical, all these other things to basically make them a little more interactive and a little more visual, because I'm always trying to improve the process, and that has honestly added weeks to the delays, just making them better. But you can expect that as the next thing, and then I'm gonna be diving into basically the last video of the course. You'll see that it lays out all those things, and that's exactly how I'm going to do it. So yeah. Yeah, Biker never used Azure Key Vault, so I'm not going to be help on that either. But curious of your thoughts. Always love the opinions and education. By the way, if you're interested in a Swarm to Kubernetes migration, I actually had one of the Docker captains detail recently all of their experiences with Swarm to Kubernetes, and I don't necessarily have permission to screenshot it or share it, but I will read it to you if you all are interested in their experience from moving from Swarm to Kubernetes and the pros and cons. And this is a very large organization. They had over 500 containers or services, I believe, in many different clusters. So they've completed their migration to Kubernetes using vanilla upstream Kubernetes, which I don't typically recommend. Their team grew from 3 or 2, I believe, to 6 full-time DevOps people managing that infrastructure. So if you're interested in that, I can read off some of their pros and cons that they have. I just don't know that I can share. I don't want to share a screenshot or like give details on names, because I'm not sure that they wanted to have it shared outside of the private Slack community. Thanks on the hairdo, and also Pickle Rick. Hello everyone. Hello. Thanks for the audio's thumbs up. All right. Clarified for me the difference between VMware, PKS, Tanzu, and OpenShift, Red Hat, as I assume what you meant. I won't be able to do that. Basically, every single it's a moving target, and you have to be someone who's actually implemented both of those to really know the difference. They're all going to have the same vanilla upstream Kubernetes functionality. The question is, what additional functionality do they add on top of it? If it was me, I'm always going to recommend you, without having implemented the products myself, I'm always going to say, do what your vendors are already doing. If you've already got alignment with your partners and vendors, if you're already a VMware shop, I would be heavily looking at any VMware solution, because that's going to have native integration, tighter integration, before I would look at another, vendor solution. I would say Rancher is probably, Rancher's the one where if you don't have a heavy vendor infrastructure already with someone like Red Hat or VMware, I would be looking at Rancher as sort of the agnostic. They're the one solution that, has a really great reputation in running up-to-date Kubernetes with leading-edge features, multi-cluster management, all that stuff. Optional support, completely open source by default, but with optional paid support. I like that approach, but if I was a VMware shop and I used VMware on all my data center infrastructure, I would basically weigh VMware solutions against Rancher, right? That would be my comparison. I'm rarely going to ever compare vanilla Kubernetes, because this is mostly we're talking on-prem, right? If you're in the cloud, I would always be comparing the cloud product to my vendor product. I would look at EKS with Fargate, possibly, because I love to outsource all of that if I can. So Fargate, if you can do it. And I would compare that against VMware. If you're a VMware shop, if you've already got a VMware contract, they'll probably throw that stuff in for free or very little additional cost. And so you're going to get out of the box stuff for that, right? If you're a Red Hat shop, if you already have an agreement with Red Hat on enterprise Linux, they're throwing in OpenShift, right? You're going to get a much better deal on that than buying support from someone else. If you're a company that's looking to get rid of, you're looking to reduce your Red Hat costs and you're trying to go to an open source Linux distribution, then maybe look at Rancher. So if you're maybe considering Ubuntu, you could look at Canonical's, which is the makers of Ubuntu. You could look at Canonical's Kubernetes and consider that and compare that against Rancher. To me, it's really about vendor relationships, because a lot of this is about support contracts. Who do you call when it breaks? A lot of this matters around the infrastructure you already have, right? And what those vendors are. So I'm never going to be the right person to ask, comparing this distribution of Kubernetes to that Kubernetes distribution. I am simply not, in my consulting work, my job isn't to rapidly implement random different distributions of Kubernetes to companies. Basically, I'm there to assist them when they get in trouble. And I really lean on their team to dive into that particular distribution and know the nuances, because we're up to 100 distributions of Kubernetes now. Everyone's doing something different. I got companies looking at Rancher, Docker Enterprise, EKS, Azure's container services, OpenShift. It's just, there's just like so many of them, and they're constantly iterating. I mean, VMware has multiple options now, so it's just, it's a lot. But I always love, that's why we have this show, is like, you can chat, you can tell me, what have you tried? Have you swapped from one to the other? Like, let me know, and I will certainly use that to share with other people. And I love to get feedback from people doing the real work of implementing, right? What's the difference between Ingress route and Ingress? Which one is more recommended and why? Ooh, great question. Okay, so Ingress these are resources in Kubernetes. Kubernetes has a built-in resource called Ingress. So that means that no third party can customize that API resource. So there's all these third-party Ingress tools. that can use the built-in Ingress resource or API, right? Same thing. But they're going to be limited to what the Kubernetes upstream project puts in as functionality, and that's going to be the lowest common denominator. So the nice thing about using Ingress, by the way, I go into this all in my Kubernetes Mastery course. You can get that up here at bretfisher.com. Coupons, by the way, this week, I've got a fire sale. If you go to my Patreon page, patreon.com/bretfisher. If you go over here and look at my latest post, I also put this on Twitter this week, so you can see it in my Twitter. But my latest post, well, maybe not my latest, 3 posts ago, I've got a fire sale on all 4 of my courses through Saturday. So if you get it today, tomorrow, or Saturday, they're all between $10 or $12. Basically, the cheapest that Udemy will let me sell them. And Kubernetes Mastery goes into detail about the difference between Ingress resources and Ingress. So the short story on there is Ingress is that built-in one, right? And that's going to be the lowest feature set out of the box, but it also means that you can swap between different vendors of Ingress, right? You can do Traffic or Nginx or AWS, and they will all work to that minimum level of basic functionality. But eventually, as you commit to a specific product, maybe you're doing Contour with Envoy, right? Maybe you like Traffic, so maybe you're doing different ones different places. Well, if you're doing that different Ingress at different places, then you're going to want to stick with the Ingress basic API resource, because that's going to give you a common set of functionality that everyone's going to support. But if you're going to be someone that says, hey, we're going to commit, we're going to use Contour with Envoy, right? Contour would be the Ingress proxy that controller, and then Envoy is actually the proxy. And I did a show on that. We actually had some guests on. So Bret Fisher, YouTube. Let's see if yeah. So right here.
Not happen.
So that video, I'll put this in chat. That video has us talking about Contour, what that means for Kubernetes Ingress and how that works. And I had, what was his name? Steve? Yeah, Steve on from VMware to talk about that. So if you decide to standardize on a specific Ingress controller, and you say like, we're going to run our Contour everywhere. That's the only Ingress we're going to use. Then you need to go with their API. And so their API is going to be a CRD, a custom resource definition. And that resource will be specific to that controller and support all of the things that controller supports that's beyond what Kubernetes comes with out of the box. The negative is that won't necessarily be a standard. So if you wanted to switch over to Traffic, then your YAML manifests would need to change, and your API resource would likely need to change. And sometimes these different vendors actually have the same API resource name, but some of them are different, all because there's no standard. So they don't really want to conflict with each other. So their API, the namespace of that API needs to be different in order for them to customize it and do their own customization without stepping on each other's toes. You can have multiple Ingress vendors. You can have multiple CRDs, right? You can have multiple controllers. So but that's really advanced, and like you probably hopefully don't want to have to do that. Ideally the goal is like you're as simple as possible. So yeah, that's the really long answer to that question. Is there a Docker solution for backing up Docker volumes to the cloud? So yeah, actually, so CSC's Pwn, so there is no tool that I know of to back up volumes. And there might be one if you Googled it. I'm not aware of one. I haven't searched for that. Last week on this show, if you just look back in YouTube on this channel, again at Bret.live, Bret.live. If you go to Bret.live and you search in there for Vackup, VACKUP, that's a tool that I created simply to see if anybody was interested in it, and I've already got 50 stars on it. So the more stars I get, the more likely I will keep supporting it, because I'll know that people are actually using it and forking it. I've got a PR on there that I'm meaning to look at. It's actually got some stuff. But anyway, all this is a shell script that simply takes your volumes and stores them either in a tarball locally or into a container image that then you could push or pull to a registry. So it's a pretty simple script. It's not that big. I mean, I don't even think it's a couple hundred lines of script. It's just a shell script. But I mean, the idea is maybe I could add an S3 option that basically would already have the AWS S3 tools in it, and so that you could just throw in your keys as an environment variable, and then maybe it would automatically push it to an S3 bucket and then manage that. I mean, that's an option that we could add. But really, all you need to do is use something like this, or just take the commands that are inside this shell script and make a simple little command that basically exports your, through a bind mount. It'll export your data, and then you use the AWS CLI to just, you tarball it up, you S3 to the bucket, pass it up to an S3 bucket, and with your own. I mean, there's plenty of command line tools to do that. So you could just write your own little command line that would maybe be like 10 or 20 lines of shell script at most. To, yeah, that's how I would do it. After last week's tips, I've created volumes backed by EFS using the built-in driver. Cheers for that. Had not had a chance to test on Swarm and failover, etc. yet. Yeah, so Paul, if you got that script and you want to put it in a gist and share it out, you can't really share links on this show because of YouTube spam and all that. But if you think it'd be valuable to somehow add that to my backup tool, that would be cool. I would be into that. Or if you think that it would be more useful if the backup tool could do that on its own. There's also really a way that there's not much work, but it could be a command line tool that actually creates a service that's cron-like, that basically runs every hour with a shell loop. Because I already do that in some examples. I've shown those before a lot, where I do, if we go over to dog versus cat, right? I have this example, which I show all the time, which is this very simple, very basic thing that stack ghost, and then this database backup essentially just does a shell script in a while. So it basically every hour it just runs a MySQL dump command and then dumps it into a volume that's mounted onto remote storage. So in this case, it could actually just dump it to a EFS. So one of the things about this is that I'm always wary of making too much magic happen in a tool when administrators probably need their own set of tooling to manage backups, because there's a lot that go on backups, right? Validate that the backup worked, validate that the backup still exists, validate that you're not overriding an existing backup unless you really want to. Like, there's a lot going on there. Usually you need it to log to some system and error if there's I hesitate for any tool that I create to say, yeah, you should totally use this in production, because someone commented on last week's video that, it really sucks when you say this tool isn't for production. Well, you can use anything in production, but it really needs to be a tool that has really valid testing and has had some actual work done and validation in long-term production usage before I would ever recommend it to someone in production. And I'm never going to do that on my own tools, right? It's like these are things I'm creating as a hobby. No one's paying me to make these tools, so I don't want to ruin your job. I mean, production is precious, so I would say that you should be validating all your own tools, whether or not someone says they're production ready. You should be validating them and testing them thoroughly. So hey, take my tools, test them. If they work great for you, then if you feel comfortable going into production, do it. But I don't think I'm ever going to say, this is production ready, you should use my tools in production. Anyway. I'm trying to understand launching Docker containers on AWS. Let's say I've got a front-end service. Would I launch multiple containers in one large EC2 or launch multiple EC2s in one Docker container? So Docker runs inside of an EC2 instance. So the real question is, like, if you back up, oh, you got another one here. Best utilize AWS EC2 resources and achieve high availability and high throughput while maximizing the EC2 resources. So it's okay. So by the very nature of you saying I want EC2, what you're telling me is I want to manage servers. I don't want to use Lambda functions or something like ECS, which ECS is AWS's container orchestrator that allows you to do ECS Fargate. And ECS Fargate means you just give it some YAML, like compose, and type YAML, and it'll run your containers for you without you having to manage servers. So the very fact that you're stating EC2 tells me that you must want to really run servers on your own. So if that's true, and that's fine if you really want to do that, then you always need multiple EC2 servers to have any level of redundancy. The minimum level of redundancy is at least 2 EC2s, and you'd want those in different failover availability zones, right? So your availability zones inside of AWS, you'd want to have an EC2 instance in each one. So in case that data center goes down, you got to have a load balancer in front of that. That's usually an ELB or an ALB. And then like the most basic, simplest thing in that case, after you've installed Docker, is to simply do Docker run on each server of your containers, which means that your containers need to be able to run simultaneously. You have to run your apps on 2 different servers and that'd be okay. So that's like basic level. Then from there you go to, okay, maybe I want to go Swarm, maybe I want to go Kubernetes. So that's how you sort of mature from there. I'm not saying you need to jump into fancy orchestration, just start. If you have a small solution and you just want to run a couple of servers, great. But the minute you want to do Kubernetes or Swarm or any sort of advanced orchestration, you have to have a minimum of at least 3 servers, because all those systems rely on a protocol called Raft, or an algorithm that does failover, and that failover always requires at least 3 servers to have failover. So, yeah. But if you're just doing Docker run or Docker compose up, which I don't really recommend doing Docker compose up, because it's really not best for production. But if you want to do that on 2 servers, you could totally do that. And that would work. And there you would probably not have issues. How to work on K8s using Windows. I have requirement to set up SonarQube with Postgres DB cluster in Windows. How to achieve this? So as far as I know, okay, so you're going to have Server 2019. So you have to have minimum Windows Server 2019. Minimum is like Kubernetes 117 or later, I think, 117, 118. I would definitely do at least 118. We're still on 118 as far as I know. So I would do that, latest Kubernetes. And you're going to have Linux servers, because as far as I know, all the managers for your Kubernetes cluster, all of the control plane nodes have to still be Linux. And then you can have worker nodes that are Windows. And then you would install the kubelet, or the worker processes you would use the Kubernetes documentation to do that. Ideally, you're doing this with a distribution like Rancher or something. And I don't know if I think Rancher supports Windows worker nodes, or just nodes. They're actually not called worker nodes in Kubernetes. They're just called nodes. And then you would have to find your Postgres. You would have to go and look up Postgres to see if it has a Windows container. So, for example, if I go to Hub, Postgres, and then scroll down. So I see there is no Postgres support officially from the official Postgres repo for Windows containers, which means you need now to go find third-party Postgres binary on Windows. Windows container. I don't even know if this exists. So, all right. So Stefan is a Docker employee. So I used to be a Docker captain before he became an employee. And Windows containers, see the blog post. So he's making a container that is able to run Postgres. And so you would basically have to make your own Postgres So look around for his stuff. All right, I'll post this in chat. So you have to make your own, basically, which I find extremely risky, and like that's a lot of work. And I mean, if that's your requirements, that's your requirements. You're stuck with it, right? But you know, I would be pushing back on the project and saying, hey, look, if we're going to do Kubernetes, we already got to have a bunch of Linux servers to run Kubernetes. So why don't we just make our nodes run Postgres, you know, on Linux? And then if we've got some .NET or some, you know, .NET framework or something that has to run on Windows, those are the only things you would run on Windows. You know, to me, every team I've worked with that does Windows, they avoid, the only thing they put on Windows is the things that only will work on Windows, like .NET framework or something .exe file that's a Windows binary executable, something like that. And by the way, I'm not anti-Windows. I have almost 30 Microsoft certifications. I am a Windows fan. It's just in the world of containers, Microsoft's always behind, and the amount of documentation and the amount of people doing it is a fraction of the people doing it on Linux. So you're always going to have a harder time finding good documentation, finding good working support. Yeah. So I'm all about the easy path. And in the world today, where so many open source tools, you can build them for Windows, you can build them for Linux. They work the same way in both. But the chances are, if you're gonna have issues with those programs, it's probably going to be on Windows, because there's always edge cases of, you know, permissions, just like Biker had earlier. You know. Let's see. All right, I'm gonna try to catch up on some of the reading here. So Biker's saying, yeah, the .NET 4 framework works quite well in spite of image size. Yeah, you know, I don't have a lot of negative feedback. Everyone who's run .NET framework, once they get their image working and they get over the fact that it's huge, and they just provision more server space, like yeah, you're right. I don't hear a lot of issues, but I haven't had to troubleshoot swarm service or swarm secrets. So unfortunately, I'm not very smart about that. But Biker, I'd love to hear what you find out and what you figure out on that. Hey, by the way, if you're watching still live, I want to point out that next week over on, if you just go to my Patreon page, every month, if you subscribe for $5 or more, if you go up to the top here, we have 2 membership levels. So I do all sorts of stuff, right? I do this show, I do open source on GitHub, I have my YouTube videos, you know, we do this live stream, I do a podcast, I do a newsletter that I haven't actually done a newsletter in a few months, but I do that. If you join the High Fivers Club, we are having a monthly hangout that I'm going to do next week, and for this month, I'm doing it a little late. So next week we have a hangout, so we all get on Zoom and we just talk about DevOps. People bring their issues, people have their questions, and we get to actually chit chat back and forth on video. So if you're interested in that, and this is basically for people that are doing DevOps, you know, as a career, and they're focused on that, and they want to talk with meet other DevOps engineers, talk with other DevOps engineers, learn from them. We're doing that as a Zoom, and then you get access to that with the High Fiver Club. So if you're interested, go check that out. And we do that once a month, and we're planning on we're thinking about a higher level that actually provides more of that. You know, so if you're interested in that, if you're wanting to get connected with other DevOps professionals, stuff like that. I'm also thinking about an exclusive Discord chat server for just those people that are doing this day to day and want to, you know, basically share what they're doing with others and have a more connected one-on-one relationship with a small group of people, basically a trusted group. We're also planning on doing that. So if you're interested at all, go check that out. Thought I'd mention that. Due to the fact that Apple is moving towards ARM architecture, should we expect stable Docker support on ARM, macOS release, and may be some performance enhancements like with WSL2 on Windows? So there's a lot to digest here. Okay, so there's a lot unknown about Apple with ARM. If you watched Apple's keynote, you actually saw that they mentioned Docker, which was incredible. They actually said Docker and parallels at the very end there when they were talking about their ARMs. So Docker only had a slight heads up that they were going to do that. They actually didn't have a deep understanding of exactly what the ARM architecture was going to do for them. But so yes, Docker Desktop will be working on ARM as far as I know. But we're going to have to wait and see how exactly that's going to work. There's so many questions. Right now, I'm assuming that you will not be able to run any Intel containers on an ARM Mac, which is a big problem. I'm very curious about the Windows ARM support. I'm nervous. So eventually I'm going to have an Intel Mac like I have now. I'm going to have an ARM Mac to really understand and help support people. I'm excited about the possibility for a future where our laptops can be fanless, kind of like that little Mac that they had for a while that was, it was an Intel Mac that was really tiny, it's like a 12-inch. I had one of those for a while. It was actually really great. It was great battery life, but the performance actually really sucked. Like, it wasn't even really possible to share your screen in a video chat without the whole system basically halting. It was kind of like the first MacBook Air. If you actually used one of those back in 2007, 2008, they actually would overheat and shut down if you tried to do stuff like that. So anyway, sorry, totally distracted. Back to that. So the other things that we have to figure out are, if you're curious about performance on Mac or WSL2, then you should be a part of Docker's Docker Desktop Insiders group. And I keep meaning to have some of the Docker people on the show to talk about this. If you're curious about this, Docker Desktop Insiders, I think it's what they're called. Let me see if I can find it. There's a process for you to get into an insiders group. The first thing you should do is, one, run the Edge release of Docker Desktop, because Docker is really working heavily on per their roadmap on desktop performance, especially on WSL2 as well as on Mac. They're working a lot on file system performance, and they've got a lot of stuff going on. So let's do Docker roadmap, and I will find you this issue. So if you are a Docker Desktop person and you care, yeah, so see right here, Docker Desktop investigate Mac CPU performance. This is getting lots of traction. They're doing lots of work right now. In fact, there are people there's at least 3 fixes in the pipeline for CPU performance issues that are partially related to file system performance because of I/O wait times. So go check that out. I put that in chat, so you can go check out that issue number 12 in the roadmap. So if you're on the Edge release, there are new things happening in Docker Desktop Edge that are going to help with file system performance, including, and let me see if I can't show you that. Here's some of the cool things if you're a Docker Desktop Insider. So if you want to be a Docker Desktop Insider, I can't find the link right now to sign up for that. And I think that's what they're called, Docker Desktop Insiders. Let me see if I can find it. Dev preview. So I need to find the link. Let me just ask them. How to sign up. So anyway, let's go back over here to this screen here. Some new features that are I'm not sure if they're completely released yet, but one of the things is there's this new file sharing system on Mac as well as Windows that uses some new features that syncs your files to resolve a lot of the performance problems with large projects, because it's not waiting on the I/O translation between different OSs. It's syncing your files into the container. This is using mutagen, however you want to pronounce it. So if you want to sync, like that, you can see that there's a couple of these down here that are my applications. So I put in stuff like this and I manually sync it. You can put in every file path you want to do. And then you can actually do that in compose files and stuff with a little colon at the end of your bind mount. That's actually in the Docker documentation. But they're experimenting with changing the backend file system from, I think it's like OXSFS to a Fuse, and they're getting a huge performance boost. But I just saw that today, so expect more on that. So I don't know that we have to wait on ARM, in other words, to do that. Yes, in theory, if you're going to be in ARM containers and you're on an ARM Mac, then maybe we could see a future where we're possibly doing containers natively on Mac, which I don't even know how that's possible because it still has to be a Linux kernel. So I still think there's going to be a VM there, and you're still going to have to cross the OS boundary. And I don't see that ARM is going to necessarily solve that problem. It's certainly not going to solve it if you have an Intel container, and an Intel container, an x86 container, right? x64 or whatever. That is still what you're going to have to run in the cloud. Like, unless you're going to run ARM servers in the cloud, which you can do, but they're relatively few options and they're pretty new. Unless you do that, you're still going to have to run Intel containers. So the real challenge and the real question here is, are we going to be able to run on an ARM Mac Intel containers in an Intel Linux VM on ARM? Which means that there's some sort of translation layer, emulation layer, and virtualization. I have not read yet that we will absolutely have. I think it's a big unknown. I haven't read anything recently, but there's a lot we don't know. This is also true, by the way, on a Windows. What is this? Windows RT or whatever the new Windows is that is supported on ARM now. That's the same problem. We're gonna have that same problem as we shift architectures. It's a complicated world that we're living in right now. Let's see. I'm reading this one. What's up, AG? Is it standard to have Dockerfile base images on environment dev test prod? No, that is absolutely something you would not want to do. I do not recommend that. I do not recommend different images based on environment. Basically, everything you would ever do in an environment needs to be an environment variable. That's my opinion. There's other ways you can do it. You can do config files, but basically you need to abstract your environment changes from your images so that you have one image and you have one Docker file essentially, and you might have different stages. So maybe your dev tools are installed as a stage in a multi-stage Docker file. Go look up multi-stage Docker file. But you're not going to necessarily be shipping different images to a registry. My rule is like, if there's something wrong with the way you're developing or designing your apps, if you have to do different images for different environments, there's definitely an improvement in that process. Because ideally, you don't want different images. That's the whole thing. That's one of the whole basic fundamental ideas around Docker containers is that there's no longer it works on my machine. Because if it's different in test than it is in production, if there's a difference in the image, then you would probably have issues, right? Like that's how you end up breaking things in production. So ideally, you're trying to get that production same image to be tested and validated, and so it's actually hash compatible. You can do a hash on it, and it's the same hash output between testing and production. In dev, you can set up a dev. Your Docker file could potentially have a stage in there that it would add dev tools, or maybe just it adds them for test and for dev, but then it strips them out for production image. So you can do a little bit of that. I show off a lot of that stuff in my more advanced examples on Docker Hub over at, if you just go to GitHub, Bret Fisher. I have some multi-stage examples. I'm not sure if, see if I search multi. Yeah, I don't have. I need to tag them maybe with some multi-stage, so to be better about that. But one of them is DockerCon 2019. So my DockerCon 19 repo right there. So you want to look on that, DockerCon 19. If you look up, I I talk about multi-stage a lot in there. I had a new one recently on Spring, a Spring app, a Java Spring app that was multi-stage. So Pet Clinic, that one is multi-stage. I'll make a note. Let me make a note to add multi-stage to tags in GitHub, so people could search on that. That'd be good. And maybe the languages. Anyway, how to learn DevOps and how to clear the AWS DevOps certification. I don't know. I've never taken the AWS DevOps certification, but if you look at bret.show/DevOps, that will give you a list. Oops. So that'll give you a list of things that I do, or how to be in DevOps. Basically, it gives you a list, my opinions, gives you reference articles and stuff like that. So go check that out. That maybe will help. Ooh, what's going to be the next big thing after Docker, Azure, AWS? I think we're going to see more GUI features in Docker Desktop. So we already are seeing that inside of Docker Edge, like they're adding functionality to the GUI, and you can see that, in the see if I can show. It's called the dashboard. So you can see that today. Here they have a GUI today, and you can see like what applications are running and what compose files are running now, which is actually more than you could ever do before with their third party tool that they had, Kitematic, I think is what it's called. So I think they're going to add more GUI to make it easier for you to manage stuff, like manage images, clean up images. I'm just, there's probably a lot of stuff going on there, but I think that's a thing. They might add, they have AWS and Azure. They might add one or two other integrations for containers on the different platforms. Who knows? They might add a functionality for you to do a Docker run or Docker compose up, and it actually deploys on Kubernetes. I don't know. They might do that. I'm speculating. I don't really have a lot of insider future stuff. We do know that they're going to add more features to Docker Hub. So expect Docker Hub to get better and to solve more problems, and because they're investing a lot of time into that. Is there some specific scenarios where you choice between Docker Swarm and Kubernetes? So that we talk a lot about that in this show. I talk about that in my Docker Mastery course. People ask this question all the time. I'd say learn both. Take my Docker Mastery course, learn both, and decide for yourself. Docker Swarm has limited functionality, but it's very easy to use. Very easy to get started with. Kubernetes has way more functionality, but is also a lot more work to get started and to use. So, yeah. I've managed to get K8s deployed with RKE, but running into issues with DNS resolving outside world DNS. Tried both core DNS and kube DNS. Any ideas? Well, I wouldn't want to be using kube DNS. That's legacy, right? Core DNS is the standard now, so definitely stick with core DNS. I'm assuming what you're saying is that inside containers you cannot resolve to outside stuff, and depending on your scenario, you want to invest some time understanding how Linux DNS works and understanding Kubernetes, like the indots, which is basically whenever you're searching for things, how many different dot notations have to happen before it uses host name versus fully qualified domain name indexing. I don't really have, I don't know if people are having issues out of the box. The way that I'm reading your question, it makes it sound like you might even be asking about things coming in. So things coming in have nothing to do with Kubernetes. Like if you're having traffic going into a Kubernetes cluster, that has nothing to do with core DNS or Kubernetes itself. That has to do with the public DNS, like Route 53 or whatever you're using for DNS to get things to the nodes. And then inside the cluster, it has to do with like namespaces and services and stuff like that. So if you feel free to ask follow-on questions with more detail. What do I think of Kubernetes distros? I would absolutely use them if at all possible. I think they are a way for you to speed up your deployments. It also means you can buy support and get help, which I think we all should have. People are, I think, this gets into a larger thing about, we all want to keep our jobs, right? So we all want to validate that we have a reason to exist. So sometimes I see a lot of people implementing really complex solutions or choosing to manage hard solutions when they really could just go with a vendor solution that would basically make it so easy that they could free up their time. And I sometimes wonder if people are not willing to go to bat and saying, I want to do what's right for the bottom line of the company. I want to do right for what's the fast approach. I want us to spend more time on business value, adding business value, increasing our deployment speeds, and I don't want to worry about infrastructure anymore. So I would rather us spend money on a distribution and paid support and accelerate this stability and the progression of our project so that we can then get back to focusing on business value and less infrastructure management. I think that's really where DevOps goes, right? DevOps takes you to that area where you automate your infrastructure so that you're less focused on infrastructure so that you can focus on the business. As a DevOps person, if you go read the origin of DevOps, it was all about metrics and fundamentals of automation and ensuring that you never repeat a failure and that you automate everything. And that means you need automation tools. And some of the vendor solutions all provide that, right? Like that's what they're doing for you. They're adding value, like better tooling on top of Kubernetes to solve problems that, like it has built-in networking, built-in Ingress, third-party Ingress, built-in web tools and backup tools and storage tools that are all a part of the vendor. So I would look at the vendors you already have, see what solutions they have for Kubernetes, and see if those solve some of your problems that you would have to use a bunch of different tools that you'd have to cobble together. For example, the Docker captain that recently went through vanilla Kubernetes deployment, they're having to solve every single problem on their own. They have to implement Kubernetes, then they have to pick a vendor for Ingress, then they have to pick a vendor for the CNI networking tool that they're going to use, and on and on and on, right? They're having to pick individual tools, and each one of those is a project. If they picked a vendor tool, probably a lot of those would have been solved. It would have been a part of the implementation of that vendor's tooling. And that vendor would have solved some of the harder problems like security and automating the updates of those tools and making sure that the controllers were running the correct versions that are compatible with your Kubernetes versions. Like there's so much of that you could accelerate and solve that problem by picking a vendor. So, and I don't really have a favorite. So I can't help you with that. We are using large compose files with 70 plus services for our dev environment. Is there any way to speed up image build process? Parallel seems does not help much, even on a 32 CPU core workstation. So, Anton, I would say one, it sounds like you're building a distributed monolith, which I've talked about before on this show. And what I mean is if you actually have to spin up 70 services or really anything more than 6 or so, or maybe even a dozen on a regular basis, just to do development on a single microservice, because I'm assuming if you have 70, you're microservicing. I think you need to look at how your microservices interact so that you don't have to do that. I had Kelsey Hightower on this show last year, and he had a really great talk about, that in distributed computing, and especially in microservices, we should not be creating distributed monoliths. And if you have to have a ton of stuff all running at the same time just to do one simple development of a simple little microservice or a distributed application, then that implies that you're creating too much brittleness between all these things interacting. They should not, need all that stuff, right? Well, that's one thing. So I've never had a client, never had a company come to me and say they have 70. I think the most I've seen in a single compose file is maybe 25. So that being said, if you have 70 and you know that you can't do any better than that, and that's you're one of the exceptions, you're the 1%er, then you need to look at multi-stage building and look at how the multi-stage with BuildKit automatically allows different build stages to be in parallel. So one of the things I do with my clients, and I'm not pitching this as like to be your consultant. But I spend a lot of time optimizing builds. So you usually, at this point, if you've got that much stuff going on, you probably have a build engineer, right? Or a team of people that are build engineers. Their job is to optimize the builds over and over and constantly optimize that. And so parallel in Docker Compose only allows you to build separate images in parallel. But inside an image itself, if you're doing standard Docker builds that aren't using BuildKit, then there is no parallelization. So what you want to do is you want to get into parallelizing that build process. So let's see, where am I at? You want to be using BuildKit. So search on BuildKit. You can search in my up there at bret.live. You can search in there for BuildKit. Watch all my videos on BuildKit. But if I'm in here, yeah, I'm in code, and then I go, let's see, Docker. Trying to think. I have see Docker pets, I think is it. And let's see, web. So I think this Docker file is multi-stage. No, it's not. Shoot. That's not the right one then. Let me go over to my browser. So okay, so this is like advanced Dockerfile stuff. So if I'm over in Pet Clinic, so this is my little example with a Java app. I think this might, I'm not sure if this is the one or not, so we're going to take a look. Dockerfile. Okay, so this is a pretty simple 3-stage Docker file. So this would not be one that does parallelism. But what you have to work towards is understanding that in a Docker file, if you use multi-stages, you can actually have it running 2 different stages at the same time. So that's the parallelism of BuildKit, which you enable at the command line so that, and again, look at the videos and look up the documentation on BuildKit to learn how to enable it. But once you enable BuildKit, it's the new builder. And there's several ways to enable it. You can do it with environment variables. You can do it with a command line option. You can do it with a new command in builder.docker buildx, I think. So one word, buildx, is the new builder. And if you do that, and then you have to design your Docker file correctly. And the way you do that is that each stage, as long as that stage is not coming from another stage, in other words, if I had 3 stages here, and one stage was only doing npm install, and then the other stage, they're both coming, both of these stages are coming from a previous stage. So if you imagine like a forking tree, you'd have the main stage up top, and then you have these 2 stages that one of them is doing an npm install, one of them is doing like a bundler approach, another one might be doing a composer, depending on what language you're using, what tooling you're using. And you could have all those coming from the same top stage. Then you could have all 3 of those stages in parallel with BuildKit automatically building, which will save you a lot of time, right? I was able to shave off 5 minutes on a 15-minute build just by parallelizing those. And then when they're all done, I do a copy command to copy the results out of one image to the next image. So when you do a copy command, you can do a copy from. I'm not sure if. See how I see down here at the bottom, I have to do a copy from build. So I can copy from one build stage to another build stage. And so at the very end, I'm basically taking all the things those other ones did. So for example, in npm install, if you're doing an npm install in your app, it puts everything in the node modules directory. So you can simply do that in parallel. My doggy just walked in. Bah! So you can do that in parallel, right? And you can watch it happen in BuildKit. You'll know whether BuildKit's doing it in parallel because you'll see it happening. And so the trick is that those builds have to come from the same. They can't be like one build depends on the next build, depends on the next build, right? You can't do it in linear like that. You have to have it to where you have one made initial, and then you have different froms that are all coming from that same first stage. And then you have a final stage that copies all the stuff into one final build. if you do it that way, it can be way faster. Because like I have 5 minutes, I see people have 5-minute npm installs, right? Or 5-minute composer builds, right? Or 5-minute, where it creates all the static assets in a bundler or a gulp or something. I've seen people do that, right? So if you're able to figure that out, and that really requires that you're not just a sysadmin, but you actually kind of have to understand the build tools and the dev environment, which is why I think a good DevOps person, if you're a sysadmin that's going to be DevOps, then you need to learn a little bit about these build tools, because if you're working on these Docker files for people, you need to understand, what does an npm install do? Where does it write files? And so the way I do that is I jump in, I actually use, so like a Docker image ls, right? So if I have like a custom one here, so like if I do a dive, right? We talked about the dive tool a lot. So dive is a tool that allows you to inspect an image, and so I do a dive pilot dev original dev. I misspelled that. So it inspects all the layers, and then I can dive into the layers just to understand, where is an image actually writing files? When I do an apt-get install, where is that installing stuff? Like, what files do I need to copy from image to image inside of my different stages? So I use dive to investigate. So if you hired me as a consultant and you said, make my Docker build times faster, this is the work I'd be doing. I'd be breaking down that Docker file, understanding how exactly your app is built, understanding exactly what commands you're running and why you're running them. Do you really need all these different tools installed? I would question everything, every single apt-get, every single npm install. And I'm going to be beating that thing up and asking you 100 questions, and then using this dive tool to get in there and actually investigate the different layers of your image to see, okay, where is it writing files? Can I just copy those out inside of a build stage from one stage to another to really speed this up through parallelism? So, okay, in this particular one, right, I'm going to, on the left, you're seeing that there's each layer here. And on the right, I can see that the files are going to be, let's see. I can see the files that are colored are the files that changed in that layer. So, all right, so nothing changed in that directory. Or in that layer. All right, so see in this layer, this layer on the left that's highlighted, on the right, it's showing me where those files were written. So I end up getting really nerdy and like diving down. This is what build engineers do. They're diving down in there and figuring out, where's it writing files? Can I speed this up somehow? Can I cache some stuff? Can I have, and by the way, there's a total big difference between a fresh build and a cache-based build, right? And you might even investigate in BuildKit, there's new functionality that will let you cache different directories. You can actually use some experimental features that work great to cache npm builds, apt-get builds, and it'll cache all those binaries inside of your Docker, not inside the image. And so you can actually save space that way and increase your build time. So look into BuildKit, cache dependencies, experimental, like maybe do some Googling on that. And you'll find BuildKit cache experimental. See, you can, those 3 words, I found a whole bunch of stuff. BuildKit features. Yeah. So go check that out. That's a really long answer. That's a long answer. All right, I'm going to keep going here. Having containers, which depends on other container to boot up for local development environment, my Spring Boot, it depends on MySQL, depends on, and Docker Compose isn't useful either. Any suggestions? Yes. You're going to want to look into, and I've talked about it on the show before. I'm trying to think what videos I would have it in. Look into Compose 2.4. I've tweeted about this many times. I've shared about this many times. Depends on with health checks. Health checks with depends on. So depends on by default will only look to say, has that container started? It won't wait for the container to be healthy. But if you add health checks to all your container dependencies, and then you use the 2.4 compose version, not the 3 series, but the 2.4, and then you go look in the documentation, you will find that there is a 2.4 feature. Let's see if I can find some of my own stuff on this. It depends on... man, it's a shame that I don't have like... jump to depends on. So right here. So in the 2 series with 2.4, there is a feature that allows you to add conditions. And one of those conditions can be, hey, I want my database to be healthy. And so then if you give your database a health check, which I talk about in my courses, if you take my Docker Mastery course or my Swarm Mastery or my Docker for Node.js course, all of those have health checks in there, and then you will have your depends on, your weight. But in production, you're not going to have that. So the reality is for production, you're going to have to solve that problem by writing the apps or controlling the apps in a way that they will retry, and they will retry, or they will restart. Right? Both Kubernetes and Swarm are designed to restart your container if it fails. So your containers, when they can't connect, either need to fail, and so they'll be recreated, or they need to retry and retry. That's the way of distributed computing. That's not a Docker thing. That is a distributed computing thing that you always have to build for. Can you use traffic with AWS ECS? Yes, you could. You could absolutely do that. Yeah, big promise of Kubernetes is portability. However, the reality is it's only about 50% portable, because you're always going to have different storage drivers. Different, unless you use the built-in Ingress, you're going to have a different Ingress provider. You're probably going to have a different CNI plugin. So it still means that like 50 to 70% of your YAML is the same, which is good, and you won't have to change your containers, but you will have to change your DevOps YAML, regardless of where how you're moving it around. So just be prepared for that. Like there is no perfect, easy swapping, Kubernetes. It's not for realistic production apps that are complex, right? Like sample apps maybe, but you're going to have some differences. Swarm and Kubernetes expose ports. The latter even exposes the API server port. How safe is it to expose these ports on the internet? I would never expose them to the internet. I don't see why you need to do that. Everyone can either VPN or you can use a high port with a proxy in front of it that requires authentication. I prefer, VPNs or, SSH tunnels. Or the Kube control actually has a proxy option. There's all sorts of other, just kind of, if you kind of look around for this stuff and Google it, you'll find all sorts of elegant solutions to solve this problem. But I would never put the raw ports on the internet, especially on the default ports or common ports. I would never do that unless they had some sort of serious authentication in front of them. There's just no reason. Like all the tooling can support, like Docker's built-in command line tooling supports an automatic SSH tunnel. So, you could put SSH on a high port and then run the Docker command line by just changing the environment variable. It's the easiest way to do that is just, something like Docker host, something like that. So if my server if I have my SSH configured for a remote server that's, I have the friendly name called Ubuntu and it has my certificate and the high port all configured in my SSH config file, then I could do that. Right? In fact, this actually works because I have a server on my local network, and that's getting, you see how it's, the server is on Linux, and Darwin is my local command line, so it's Mac. Although, to be fair, that this would actually be the same output if my local machine did it, because on Mac, you're actually using a Linux VM. But anyway, trust me, it's a remote Ubuntu machine. Kubernetes has a little bit different ways to do it, but keep music on, supernatural feelings. All right. In which cases is it advisable to use containers with SSL, test prod when you work with DBs? honestly, that's nothing to do with containers. That has to do with your security team's requirements. If your security team does not require things inside your container orchestrator to be SSL'd between containers, it will be more efficient and less costly for you to not have to deal with that. If you're on Kubernetes, Service Mesh is part of what's trying to handle that problem, is they're trying to automate the encryption. You can also do network layer encryption, like you can do swarm overlay with IPsec at the kernel level, which is a little bit more efficient than SSH or SSL, which is at the application level, right? It's at HTTP or at DB connections. But it all depends on your requirements, man. I think me as a DevOps person, I am not going to naturally, I'm going to want as much authentication as possible and encrypt authentication, but I'm not necessarily going to opt in to every single connection inside my cluster. And again, my cluster is in a single data center, so I should be able to trust that data center network. But if you're in financial, banking, like maybe some healthcare, where you can't trust the network you're on and everything from the application layer has to be encrypted and that's your requirements, then yeah, then do it. But I'm not going to opt into every possible encryption option because that's just going to add more work. I'm going to have higher latency, more CPU usage, higher administration, more administration burden, more things to break. But absolutely on the internet, like of course, like every client connection, I always want it to SSL. Like everything on the internet should be SSL at this point, or TLS. So, would you recommend using K3s for production cluster as an entry in the kube world instead of using Swarm? Sure, but here's the reality. K3s only solves one of the many complex problems of Kubernetes. Like, it only solves the deployment of the nodes problem. It doesn't solve, think of it Kubernetes, like think of that K3s as a distribution. All the different distributions have their own automated tooling installation, right? What K3s does for you, or K3s or Ks, or keys, or how you want to say it, keys, it makes it, to me, the real advantage of it is it reduces the requirements on infrastructure resources. So you can run it on a much smaller burden of CPU. It's a single binary, much smaller memory footprint, less disk space usage. But to me, it's never going to change my manifest. My YAML files in Kubernetes are still going to be at least triple the size of my Swarm YAML files. You're still going to have all those third-party add-ons. Like regardless of what solution you use, you're still going to have like some sort of Ingress proxy. You're going to have to deal with storage, and Kubernetes requires that you add some sort of third-party networking where Swarm has at least a built-in networking. So I don't know. I don't know that K3 is necessarily as a comparison to Swarm. I will tell you that Darren Shepard, who's been on this show, who created K3s at Rancher, he has talked about that. He was trying to make Kubernetes as easy as Swarm, and that's what K3s is doing. But K3s is never going to change the manifest that you still have to write and all that YAML that you still have to create. And all that work, right? You have to learn all the different resource types and understand them all and understand the RBAC and all that. So I don't know. Yes, it does make it easier, but it's never going to be as easy as Swarm is for like taking a compose file and deploying it in Swarm is super easy. And like your dev compose and your Swarm compose can be very similar and very close. So yeah, I don't know. Can you say some of the specific differences between the 100 different distros of reasons why you would pick one over the other? Paul, if you were here at the beginning, I actually went through that for like 5 minutes. So you probably heard all that, and I probably answered all your questions. I'm just way behind in chat because of all this chat. How to manage cron jobs. That would totally depend on the orchestrator and the tooling. Both Swarm and Kubernetes have cron jobs. Kubernetes has cron built in. Swarm has it built in if you build from master. Swarm, if you're using a standard Docker runtime, doesn't have it because we're waiting on a Docker release because it's in the main master branch, but it's not in the actual release of Docker yet. So with Swarm, you need to get a third party, but if you just search cron Swarm, you'll find some GitHub tools that people have used to do that. Thanks for buying my courses, Pawan, or Pawan. Sorry, I messed that up. Which cloud is best for DevOps tools? whichever one you're already using. They all have DevOps tools. A lot of people like the DevOps tools on Azure. I hear more about people liking those that are specifically people that are not trying to be DevOps people. But I think that in any cloud, you're always going to have a combination of your own DevOps tooling. And because again, there is no real such thing as a DevOps tool. Let's talk about that for a second. There is no DevOps tool. There are only tools that help you reach your DevOps goals. Okay, so your DevOps goals should be the fundamentals of DevOps, which have nothing to do with the tool. You could talk about DevOps all day and never mention a specific tool because it's about automation, which automation kind of implies infrastructure as code. Because in order to automate, it has to be codified, or at least in some sort of description format like JSON or YAML. And then you're going to want to add metrics, which means you have to monitor and measure, and then look at metrics about failure rates and recovery rates, and all that stuff. And that's where the serious DevOps professionals focus their time, is on automating and then adding metrics to measure the automation. Is that automation working? Does it break? Does your automation suck? Is it breaking all the time and causing problems? Are you having outages that you did not know happened because you're not monitoring that particular thing that failed? And so that's one of the rules I have for DevOps teams is always, if you have a failure if a user told you about a failure, or if ops told you about a failure that was not measured, then you need to have a new metric to monitor that type of failure. And that should be a part of your pipeline, is like you're going back and implementing new automation and tooling and monitoring metrics and this is ops working with devs, right? To add new functionality to make sure that this is all working so that you never have the same failure twice. Well, I should say that if you have the failure more than once, you knew about it when it happened, right? So this is all about like unknown failures. If users are telling you about your app being broken, then that's an opportunity for improvement in the DevOps lifecycle. What tools you do to do all that doesn't matter. There is, again, no DevOps tool. Everyone that's marketing a DevOps tool is just selling you a tool to help you achieve your DevOps goals. Again, automation, monitoring, metrics, and business performance. At the end of let's do some DevOps stuff, I need to know that the company is able to achieve its goals faster as a business. That means shipping faster, recovering from failure faster, less failure, more automation, less people doing more work, which means more automation has to happen in order to do that work. So that's DevOps, not Jenkins and Terraform. That's not DevOps. Hope that makes sense. That's my soapbox. But it's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. I'm glad you asked that question. Be a polyglot. Good advice. Cool background animation. Thank you. I try to have a new one every so often. If you're on, I'm catching up, by the way, on chat. Sorry, I'm behind. If you're on Windows or Windows Server, this is a big one. How many different ways are there to run containers? What I think I know are Docker for Windows will run a Linux VM in Hyper-V to run containers. Switching to a Windows container seems to run Windows and Linux containers in tiny VMs. If you're on Windows Server, you might be able to run Windows containers without VMs. And now there is some WSL2 thing. Is there a visual aid for this or something? That's actually a great question. So let's talk about the difference between Windows devs and Windows servers. So it's way simpler on a Windows server. A Windows server can do two things. It can run a VM, and that VM could run a Windows container or a Linux container. But that Linux container has to be inside of a Linux VM, right? A server does not run Docker Desktop or Docker for Windows, right? That's Docker Desktop. You do not run that on a Windows server. A Windows server is running a docker.exe or dockerd.exe. The daemon is a Windows process on the Windows server. You install that with PowerShell. There is no GUI. And that runs Windows containers. Those containers can be either process containers or isolated containers in Hyper-V. That's the only two type of EXEs you can run in a container on Windows Server. You could create a Hyper-V VM and then install a Linux container in that Linux VM. But that's really just running Linux containers on a Linux VM, right? That's not really Linux containers on Windows. That only exists in the scope of Docker Desktop for a local developer on Windows 10. So that's Docker for Windows. That's for Windows 10. And that's simply to add convenience. So yes, you can run Linux containers in WSL, Linux containers in WSL2, and you can run Windows containers and it runs it in Hyper-V isolation on Windows 10. And the fourth way, right? So is process isolation. So there's 4 ways: process isolation, Windows EXE, Hyper-V isolation, Windows EXE, Linux in a Hyper-V VM. I think I might have said WSL1, but that's technically not possible. So Linux in a Hyper-V VM or Linux container in WSL2, which is technically a Linux VM. It's just a tiny one. So these are really just 2 Linux VMs that are running Linux containers, or one is a Windows container running in a Hyper-V VM, and the other one is a process isolation. Okay, so that process isolation is what you want to strive for on Windows Server, because it's the thinnest and leanest way to run a container on Windows Server. And you can also do that in Windows 10 as of latest releases on Windows 10 Pro. You have to have Pro or Enterprise to do that. So I hope that helps. Hope that breaks that down. Greetings from Paraguay. Hello, Carlos. How Kubernetes can help for testing, process, integration, performance, acceptance. So many developers ask me this. Well, really, that's about automation. Kubernetes can help you automate the spinning up of applications quickly and then tearing them down when they're done. Right? That's the short. That's the short of it. If your production is Kubernetes, ideally you would like to test on the same platform that you're going to deploy on. So your testing could run on Kubernetes, and you could use something like Kind, Kubernetes in Docker, KIND. Kubernetes in Docker allows you to test inside of your testing system by spinning up tiny little Kubernetes clusters really quickly, and then deploying on Kubernetes to test and making sure that the containers can all talk to each other. And then you can tear that down really quickly because you can just delete the cluster just by running a kind command, and it just deletes the whole cluster inside of a Docker container. So that's how you do it. It's just really automation, spinning up apps, running the tests, tearing them down. And the key is it's in containers. So a lot of people that run on Kubernetes in production don't ever actually use Kubernetes in testing. They just spin up Docker containers, and maybe they use standard Docker networking. But as you get more advanced, you might want to test inside containers, inside of Kubernetes, inside your CI/CD system. I avoid the edge release as I don't want to be developing on things that aren't available on my servers. Sure. Yes, I wouldn't disagree with that. Although, typically, I will tell you that edge releases of Docker Desktop are not giving you new versions of Docker Engine that are not available for production. So what Docker Edge tends to do is give you Docker Desktop features like new GUI features, or give you the option of experimental command lines that you have to manually enable even in Edge, which you can actually enable that experimental on your servers. So experimental and Edge are actually 2 different things. Experimental is about enabling experimental functionality in the command line or in the daemon, and you can do that on any release of Docker daemon or Docker command line. And Docker Desktop Edge, because there is no Edge release of Docker Engine. The Docker Edge for Docker Desktop is really about experimental features in Docker Desktop. So new file performance, I/O things, which are not about server. They're about Docker Desktop features, right? Docker Desktop GUIs, which is not about servers. So I would say, Paul, that I'm not advocating necessarily that you go Edge, but I'm saying that if you have performance problems or issues in Docker Desktop today, you can shift back and forth, by the way, between Edge and stable releases on Docker Desktop. So you could do that. But that's not going to necessarily get you, I wouldn't see that necessarily you're running, on my local Docker machine, I'm running 1903.12 in Edge. You can even see this here. My local command line is 1903.12, and I'm running Edge, right? But my server is on Linux, and it's not running Edge. It's just running the standard release of Docker you can get from Docker's apt-get install, and it's the same version. So it's a question there whether or not I enable experimental features in the daemon or in the command line. That's what matters, I think, for what you're thinking about. And I agree that that's confusing, and it has changed over time. Docker used to have an edge release of the community for server, but they don't anymore. I tried to get WSL2 set up on the instructions, said to go Windows Update to get new versions, but it didn't work. So is there a way to get WSL2 working without switching to the beta channel or whatever? Yes. The 2004 patch is a release version. It has nothing to do with the Insider. It came out in the late May, like right around DockerCon at the end of May. The 2004 update release for Windows is out. And all you need to do is install that. And you don't have to be on beta, because I installed it on my Windows machine that's not running Insider Preview. And that allowed me to then upgrade you have to first enable WSL if you don't have it enabled. Then you have to update your WSL2 stuff to WSL2. Microsoft has documentation on that. And then once you've done that, then you can go into Docker and click the box, enable WSL2 functionality, and then it will go through. And it's like a 5 or 6 step process because Microsoft didn't want WSL2 enabled by default for people that already had WSL1, right? So, but you don't have to do that without beta. You can do that right now without beta. AWS also seems to be pushing new ARM-based instance types. I think everyone will need to support it going forward. I'll be honest. I am not impressed with their ARM. If you do the price per CPU, price per compute, if you do it on performance-based, you don't get anything out of ARM that you don't. In other words, taking your workload and taking it from Intel and then making an ARM-based build of your app and then putting on ARM does not save you money on Amazon. They won't tell you that, but it does not save you money. There have been analyses done on apps running, and when you talk about CPU transactions, like how fast can my stuff run, it has to be very, very specific workloads that are meant to do very specific things on ARM before you will get better money. You'll get more for your money, in other words. The thing that it might help you, though, is if you're looking to run the smallest instance, the cheapest thing possible, and you don't even care because it barely gets any I/O, then there probably is an ARM that's like $16 that's cheaper than anything you would get on a tiny or whatever instance with a nano instance or whatever on AMD, right? So I do agree with you on that, but don't be fooled. ARM instances don't instantly save you money because you might be paying less, but you're also getting less capacity in your compute if you look at the third-party analysis of how fast those CPUs are. Now, that might change if they get the new ARM architectures going. And I haven't checked this in 6 months. It's been at least since actually late last year. So I could be outdated, but the last I checked, I did a big, multi-hour review of all this stuff, and the ARM processors, I don't know if it was version 8 or whatever, but the ARM processors that they were using at the price that they were offering it did not save you money on compute power, if that makes sense. Because that's the big question, right? Can I spend the same amount of money and get more compute power, or can I spend less money and get the same compute power? And that's just that at the time it was not true with ARM. Let me know in the comments if you think differently or if you have found that to be different, because I did find some really good testing by third-party labs that disproved that. Previously, I was using Docker Sync, and now I am using that mutagen sync option in Docker Desktop from Mac Edge version. I noticed a slight improvement in CPU performance. Yeah, so they actually have another option coming too as well. If you don't want to use full mutagen, it's now available in like the preview, and they'll hopefully be coming in Edge. So it's going to be changing the backend file system to get even better. I think they were able to say that they were able to like an order of magnitude performance improvement. Using Docker with general D logs, that doesn't seem to work if Docker is running in the snap. If I want to continue using the snap, should I go back to using JSON file, or is there a better choice? I don't know, because I've never used Docker and Snap. I personally think that Docker. So to me, Snap is about simplifying the application deployment process, but that's what Docker does for me. So I am more of a fan of, I put Docker on a server natively through apt, and then I only run containers after that. Everything I do is containers. So the only thing on my server besides the base Ubuntu install is Docker. I ignore Snap. And then Docker is my Snap, right? Docker from that point is doing the Snap type of thing, that it's doing package-based installs that are easily removable through containers. And then when I want to update Docker, I may just throw that machine away, right? Because ideally, the only thing on that machine is Docker. So how hard is it to create a new machine? Basically my my install scripts on auto scaling groups in AWS is like 4 lines. It's basically install Docker, done. If it's on a swarm, it's install Docker, join swarm. It's 2 lines. So so sorry. Unfortunately, my answer there, 6 corners, is I don't know. I've never used Snap with Docker. I didn't even know there was a Docker Snap. But I would say stop using snaps. Solve that problem for you. Probably less work to do that than it is to change your logging driver from journal D to JSON. But I'd say that the decision on logging driver to me is really more about where are you sending your logs and how is it getting to those systems in the back end, and just use whatever is the easiest way for that system to get them. I have applications which are multi-third-party applications. I have applications which have multiple third-party applications like Tomcat, Apache, MySQL, Redis. What do you suggest to put these applications in different containers? Absolutely. Put them all in separate containers. All of them. I didn't know it existed, a Docker certification, only Docker. Yes, there is something called the Docker DCA, right? Docker Certified Associate. But that is now maintained by the company Mirantis, because it's really more about the Docker Enterprise solution. It's not about Docker Open Source. It is about Docker Open Source, but only about 50% of it is about Docker Open Source. The rest of it's about the paid solution, which is no longer owned by Docker Inc. It's now owned by Mirantis. So it's kind of a weird. They really need to change that certification to call it the Mirantis Docker certification or something like that. So I'm not even a fan of it anymore, because the only time I would ever recommend it to someone is if they were actually going to run Docker Enterprise and become a Mirantis customer, because it's kind of like, to me, it's like getting a distribution certification. There is no, that I know of, there is no like open source Docker certification that is known in the industry as a standard for the open source. Kubernetes has that. The Kubernetes certifications are run by the Linux Foundation and are on the open source Linux. And that is a more general Kubernetes certification, right? It's not a vendor specific. All right. But DCA is the one certification that I have taken recently, in the last few years at least. And it's very much about Docker Enterprise. Is Docker Swarm being depreciated? No, it is not. It is maintained by Mirantis. They have publicly stated multiple times this year that they're adding new features to it. It is open source and is still a part of Docker, but the Docker team at Docker Inc. is no longer putting much effort into it. They're basically going to just wait for Mirantis to add features, and then they'll ship them with Docker as Mirantis adds features. But I haven't seen recently that they've added any new features since January. Last time they added features was in January. They added cron support for Swarm. Non-root user in containers. Can I configure my Docker environment as non-root? Or configure it in every container? Test. I would say there's a lot of ways to talk about, like maybe you're talking about running Docker not as root on the host. Maybe you're talking about user namespaces, which is a feature you can enable in Docker. So then Docker daemon runs as root, but then when it spins up containers inside of containerd, it's running those containers as a non-root user. Then there's also inside your Docker file, you can use the user command to change whichever user is running the app in your container. I'm not sure which level you're talking about, but all three I have videos on somewhere. I've talked about somewhere. So you're saying non-root user in container. So yes, look up the Docker file and the Docker docs and look up the user command in the Docker file. And that is how you change. You can change it back and forth. You can change it to root, do some things, change it to a regular user that you've created manually, and then do some things. Some applications already do that for you. Like if you look at the node containers, the node containers create the node user for you. And then all you got to do is type user node in your Docker file, user node, and it will change to run your app as the regular node user, not as the root user. So, how in Kubernetes Docker not just JBoss all over again? Sorry, I don't understand that question. How is Kubernetes Docker not just JBoss all over again? I don't see any analogies there. Isn't I don't know JBoss that well. I thought JBoss was like a CI/CD platform. I mean, Docker Kubernetes are containers. Containers are something that allow you to run your application and all its dependencies in an isolated environment on any operating system with consistency. Plus, also, it has a non-vendor specific internet standard of package format. So unlike any other packaging format, it includes all the dependencies of your app with your app so that it's you can actually use a SHA hash to guarantee that your app is on my machine and it's on your machine and they're identical to the bit level. And all dependencies are exactly the same. So I don't know. I mean, there are a few other solutions, Singularity, I think a few others that kind of do something like that. I don't know JBoss that well. So I don't know if it does that, but that's, containers are the standard way to do that now. I think that they're the most, you can run them on mainframe, 32-bit Linux, 64-bit Linux, ARM, Windows, it's just there's a dozen different platforms now that can all run that same standard. And then also has a repository to store your applications in a central repository, regardless of whether it's in your data center or in the cloud or whatever. It's all standards. So it's and you don't have to buy any third-party software to do any of that stuff. You can do all of that in open source. So I don't know if JBoss is anything like that. So I'm not sure if that's a helpful answer. That may answer it, or that may be nothing like what you hoped for. No, containers aren't able to resolve rancher.home.lab. If I switch to default DNS policy, it works, but not with cluster first deployed via vSphere VMs. Yeah, and I don't know. Yeah, that would require more advanced troubleshooting. I'd have to spend some time on that. I don't really have any recommendations. Sorry, RoboDude666. I don't have much help for that off the top of my head. But you might want to look into the dot notation. Yeah. Like maybe rancher.home.lab. That rancher.home.lab to me doesn't sound like the standard dot notation of a Kubernetes cluster. So if you go look up the Kubernetes documentation, it talks about the default standard DNS names, the fully qualified domain names of things, so of services, specifically of services. So I'm not, there is a dot notation within dots where finding names is a thing. So I'm not sure how savvy you are on DNS. I'm not saying I'm the world's most expert on DNS, but I have been dealing with DNS servers for 25 years. So I'd say that if you're not fully invested in DNS tools like Dig, and NS lookup and stuff like that, and understanding, but it sounds like you've got the fact that you're talking about DNS policies, it sounds like you've got some experience in there. I'm not really sure what the next step is for you to troubleshoot, so sorry. Kubernetes is full of foot guns. I don't know what foot guns is, but that sounds like it hurts. Let's see. I've created a Docker Compose file to spin containers with 3 networks, but those networks are connecting to the random order inside the container. And I control the behavior of interface card attachment inside Docker container like networks 1. Yeah, I'm not sure that you can. Can I control the behavior of interface card attachment inside Docker? I don't believe so. I mean, everything in Docker networks is DNS based. So if your applications are having problems and you have to care about the order of those networks, you need to shift your applications to look up things in names, not in interface, because you can't guarantee the names of the interfaces or anything like that, as far as I know. There might be ways. There's so many Docker options nowadays. I tend to forget all of the esoteric options with Docker Run. But ideally, every application should be relying on finding other things, not through which particular network, but through DNS resolution. And then that will let Docker tell the app which network it needs to go out, which IP to find which container. That's how that works. So I hope that helps. I love you, man. Cool, man. I love you too. Love on the internet. It's a good thing. It keeps us all sane. We need more of that. What are good Ingress proxy options which OAuth, OIDC authentication? Actually, that's a great question. I don't know. Tell me what you find out. I don't know which ones support Ingress, but if you look up Ingress comparison, look up Kubernetes Ingress comparison, you'll find a couple of good things. One of them is done by Rancher. Rancher has a pretty good comparison. They might actually mention that as a part of their comparison. There is someone out there, and I think it's a Google Sheet. So you might even go on Google Sheets and search public Google Sheets for Kubernetes Ingress, and you might find, or maybe I'm thinking of not of Ingress. I'm thinking of maybe CNI plugins. Sorry, but anyway, I have found some good results of comparisons, but I don't know if those comparisons have OAuth information in them. I have always been recommending since the beginning to not use databases with Docker and orchestrators in general. Is this a rule of thumb? No, I don't think so. I think that I would change that statement if I were you. I would say, don't run your own databases if at all you can avoid it. If you can outsource your databases to a cloud platform or to someone else that is a permanent database solution architect person, you're always going to be better off because they're going to be better at it than you are. Running your own databases sucks. I don't care whether it's in containers or on real servers. I think we are now at the point where I can say, if you are already running containers and you have been running them for a while and you know how to run them and you are looking to run your own databases and you have no choice but to run your own databases, then run them in containers. There's simply no reason not to. I do not recommend doing that on your first container project simply because databases are hard. And why make your first container project harder? I always tell people on their first container projects, leave the databases wherever they are. Wherever they are now, leave them there. Put your apps in containers. Do that for 6 months. At least 3 to 6 months, full time. Like learning all the ways that containers suck and that they can, everything changes. Troubleshooting changes, backup changes, monitoring changes. Like it all changes. Networking changes. You need experience with that. You need to understand the right way to troubleshoot and the tooling and everything you need. And then once you have all those skills and you're a pro, then you go, okay, I might do databases now. But there's no reason to fear databases and containers. A container is just an application running on a Linux host or a Windows host. It's native, right? It's I've been running containers and databases for 4+ years. And the only time that they screw up is when I run the wrong commands. I mean, in other words, if I accidentally delete Docker volume that has the Docker database in it, or accidentally delete a Docker running container that is the Docker database, then obviously, yes, that's going to be a problem. I hurt the database. And I have done that. That's because very early on, I was trying databases before I understood all the ins and outs of containers. And, I didn't understand where Docker stores volume files yet. I was really young and I was playing around, and for a small project, I was running databases, and the database, I think, had been in production for a couple of days for my little project, and I accidentally deleted the production database because I didn't understand the subtleties around the difference between named databases and unnamed databases. So if you do a Docker Compose file, again, this was 2015, 2016, so it was pretty early. If you run a Docker Compose file and you don't give it a named database, then it won't reuse the same database volume every time. If the volume is not named, it considers it an anonymous database volume. Well, just a database, just a volume, right? So you have anonymous volumes, named volumes, and then bind mounts. Those are really the three kinds. And for databases, you always want either a bind mount or a named database. I prefer a named volume, not a named database. A named volume. And if you do anonymous volume, which is what I was doing in that day because I did not understand the difference, then every time you create the container, it will create a new volume. Which means if you update the database to a new version, if you change out the container or you simply start up a new container, it will create a new volume. And that's a problem. You want it to use a named volume so that it's always connecting to the same volume every time the database starts up. And that's not database specific. That's just how volumes work. But I didn't know that, for example, because I was a dummy and I had not truly tested all this stuff. So again, know containers well before you start doing stuff like persistent data. Not really even a database thing. It's just persistent data. It's more to learn. It's more to understand. Great question. That's a great question. Thank you so much for that. Now 84 or now 82. Thank you for that question. Serverless, is it DevOps popular tool? I saw that allows you to run Docker, Lambda, and Cloud Formation Stack all in one command. Okay, sure. Yes, serverless makes it easier. And really what you're doing with serverless is you're outsourcing your infrastructure, which I think is the future of all things. However, do realize that serverless on their end, whoever's running your serverless for you, right? Because there is no serverless, it's just someone else's servers. Whoever's running those servers for you, they're running your stuff in containers almost always. So we're just outsourcing. Serverless is a tagline or a term like Lambda, like Google Cloud Run. You could even argue that EKS or ECS on Fargate is serverless because it's someone else's servers. You don't see a server. You can't SSH into it. You don't even know how many servers are there. That is outsourcing your servers. And that is what serverless is all about. When you talk about functions as a service, that is really just a layer of abstraction. And in that case, you don't have to care about what's installed on the OS. But a lot of functions as a service are what you're doing is you're spinning up on their system a really big container with a whole lot of dependencies that are installed, and hopefully it has your dependencies in it. I tend to prefer a leaner approach of building my own, like OpenFaaS, which is a serverless solution that you build Docker files for, and you're running serverless, but you're building a Docker file. I prefer that over something like build packs because I don't want a ton of dependencies I'm not using built into my container, because that's a lot more code sitting in my app that I'm not using that could be a security concern. That's why everybody likes to use Alpine, because it reduces the number of installed dependencies. But what I'm seeing is this trend in serverless, because it's easy, is we're ending up with these huge build packs that have all sorts of dependencies that you're never going to need in your app. But it makes it easier for the application developer to just deploy their app. They don't have to know about their dependency tree or what dependencies they really need. They just deploy the app. Who cares, right? Heroku does this. And there are pros and cons to that. I love that stuff because it's super easy. I deploy Heroku apps all the time. I have a Heroku app right now that's not running in a container because it was just super easy to spin it up. I didn't even have to care. But it's probably running a 2 gig container image with all sorts of dependencies that I will never need. And that's a security concern. So if you are someone who's super hyper focused on DevSecOps and you have security requirements and they want to know what's running on this server, what applications are installed in the server, and some team has to authorize all that, then you're going to have a hard time with serverless and with all of these solutions that basically run build packs for you. The way to get around that is to build your own Docker files and then run that on something like EKS Fargate or Docker or Google Cloud Run or even on Heroku, where you can run your own containers and you can control all the exact dependencies that are in the scope of your app, right? So when you do that, that means that you can ensure that you know every single binary, and it can go through a security scan, and your security team can thumbs up that and say, we know every binary that's on that machine that application can see, and they can sign that off, right? So you can technically still be serverless there, right? Because you don't even know how many servers are behind that. And you don't have to patch those servers, right? You're just letting someone else handle that problem. So to me, that's serverless as well. So. And yes, hello, Michael. Yes, I did say Heroku, and I'm a fan. I'm a fan of all things easy. It just depends on the requirements. So Michael and I often have discussions around why Docker, why not just Heroku, and I often lose that debate. I lose that argument. If it's not really an argument, it's more like nerds nerding out. What is your view on specifics of DevOps practices in embedded development when you have a limitation of so many instances of real hardware boards connected to your CI system? I'm not really sure. Alex, can you give me a more specific question in that limitation? Like, what exactly DevOps practices are you? I mean, is it just because it's slow? Like, I'm not sure what exactly is your problem and what you're looking for. I mean, and if you have limited resources, that has nothing to do with really embedded. If you're limited on the number of resources and things are slow, the only option is to get more resources. I'm not so help me out. Give me a better question, and I'll see if I can answer it. All right, so I've been in this for 2 hours. I'm going to see if I can get through a bunch of the rest of these questions in 10 minutes, and we'll wrap this up. As a follow-up to my question about exposing ports, why do K3s and Swarm expose their ports by default? When I use DigitalOcean Kubernetes clusters, the API endpoint you connect to, I think, is just a weird URL on the internet. Are these scripts or something to hide the ports using IP tables, or to only have them be exposed over WireGuard? So there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm not going to be able to go into all that. One, Swarm does not expose ports by default. So when we talk about exposing and publishing, there's a nuance there, so I hope you understand the difference. In Docker or Docker Swarm, when there's an exposed port is simply inside the network, inside the nodes, right? The port's exposed on the open IP that's public on the node, public meaning to the local network of the node. Swarm doesn't do that. It only exposes it inside the virtual network that is only inside the Swarm itself. Swarm does not firewall anything inside a Docker virtual network. Each virtual network is its own VLAN, essentially. So if you're a networking person, sounds like you are, because you're talking about WireGuard and IP tables. So in Docker, it's doing that inside. So essentially, each Docker network you create is a private VLAN between all the nodes using an overlay type driver, which is using the IPVS functionality of your Linux kernel. So that is safe, right? It's protected. You can even encrypt that with IPsec by just adding an option. I think it's encrypted or something on the Docker networks when you create them. So that's how Docker works. If you want those ports to be exposed, now we're talking about the apps, not Docker itself, just the apps. If you want their ports exposed, then you publish the ports. And then it will manually assign that port and then route it through IPVS again inside the kernel. K3s does something similar. It's really when you talk about that, you're talking about Kubernetes networking, and that's dependent upon the networking driver, because Kubernetes itself doesn't do very much networking. The minute you need 2 nodes in a Kubernetes system, you have to go get a third-party Kubernetes networking provider, and it's going to be completely dependent upon that networking driver, how things work. On Kubernetes, by default, the networking drivers are typically going to only expose those ports are exposed on the private subnet, not on the public IP of the node. So again, I'm not really sure what you're talking about. But then you said something about the API endpoint, which is a totally different thing. That's not related at all to like your applications and how the pods work and how Swarm works. When you say API endpoint of Kubernetes, you're talking about the service, right? So a service is a published, or they call it exposed in Kubernetes parlance. But that is deliberately putting that port, in the case of DigitalOcean, I believe what they're doing is they're putting it on a node port, which means that a specific high port on the node, or all the nodes, will tunnel that traffic through IPVS to wherever the pod or container that's running the Kubernetes API is at. So yes, but that is how most of these... that's how DigitalOcean exposes the API, and that's specific to DigitalOcean, right? So every distribution of Kubernetes is going to treat that API endpoint, which is a service, not a pod. That service is going to be treated differently. And services have their own, a bunch of different types. There's at least 4 types, right? You have cluster IP, you have node port, you have load balancer, and then you have basically none. It's just a null that allows you to basically only use like load balancing. You use endpoints, and you don't have to have any IP address for it. So sorry, that's a really long answer to that question, but there was a lot to unpack there. Is there any news about Docker on FreeBSD? No, I have none. Sorry, Anton. I like FreeBSD. I used to be a huge fan of it. I used to run actually a small little ISP back in the day 20 years ago for a neighborhood that didn't have their own internet, and I used to run it all on a bunch of FreeBSD and Solaris servers back in the 90s. But no, I have not heard anything about the future of that. That patch haven't released to all Windows yet. So yeah, if you're talking about the 2004 patch yet, as far as you can go get that patch right now. It is, again, you don't need it. If you just go look, there's a way to, without going beta, there's a way to go request the update. And I don't have the quick URL to that, but because I was tired of waiting, you just simply go to a website and Windows, supposedly as of right now, unless you're on an LTS release, again, with Windows 10, there's 1,000 different things. But if you're on Windows 10 Enterprise LTS, right, you're good luck. You're basically years behind everybody else, and I can't help you. But if you're on a standard normal install of Enterprise or Pro or Home, if you just go into Windows Update, and I've checked this on 3 different systems on 3 different licenses, and you go in, and if you don't see it saying, would you like to manually install this 2004 patch? If you manually click Windows Update, and this is me reading from the Windows blog themselves, they actually put this on their own blog, it will then, that's the way for Windows to say, you're asking for that patch. So you go in and you manually check for Windows updates, and then it will supposedly prompt you to download the 2004 patch. Unless you're on an LTS release, which is super slow to update anything. What if the Docker daemon died? Are the containers still running in the system? Yes. That's a short answer. Yes. Is there a way to get details about namespaces used in containers using Docker? Namespace used for containers using Docker. Yes. That's all about learning Docker internals. Docker creates its own namespace, and it manages namespaces. And you can use something like NSEnter or nsetter. You can look up that tool. That's a tool that you can look at. Marathon format, all Docker, all the time. I know. I've got to run, but we're going to see if we can do it. I'm pretty close to the end. Are there any dashboard open source projects for Docker Swarm? Yes, Portainer. Absolutely, Portainer is the best one. There's also one called Swarm Pit, I believe. Look up Portainer. Yes, I've started looking into NDOT and got into a rabbit hole of other networking issues. You've sent me on the right path, so hopefully that'll help. Thank you. Good luck, RoboDude666. Bret Free Association. Check out. Yeah, Portainer and Swarm Pit. Yep, there you go. Can I create a service for external host name like CloudFront and then route traffic using Ingress? Yes. That is that's a type of service in Kubernetes. So if you just go look that up, Kubernetes service types. Did someone already answer that? I don't know if they answered that. It's like it's a headless services without selectors. So look this up in the documentation. But services most commonly abstract to access pods, but they can also abstract to other kinds of backends. For example, you want to have an external database cluster in production, but in your test environment, you use your own databases. You want your point your service to a service in a different namespace or a different cluster. These are all the reasons to do that. So you can do that. And you basically create endpoints, and then you do it that way. Yeah. In the docs, man, in the docs. I'm really young. How can I know beforehand that I don't screw up? I have screwed up so many times and failed so many times. That's how I learn. So if you're afraid to screw up, that shouldn't stop you from going forward, right? Have a bunch of everything you do. You should have a test system for it. Everything you do, you should never do production as the first time you do something. You should always have tests and staging and all these different clusters and all these different types of tools. Even my DevOps professionals, I insist that they have a cluster that they use that is production for just a certain part of the customers. So maybe you have a production cluster or production Docker that's only for the IT team inside your inside your organization. And then if you're going to screw up, you'll screw up there first, right? So it updates for them, and they get a special version. And so you're only breaking it for them and not external customers that are really important or something like that. So always look for ways to have other types of test systems, and then you feel free. You don't have to worry so much about messing things up. A database on a Mac slow because of file system synchronization. Okay, so Biker, yeah. I don't find that to be true, Biker. I'm interested in your experience. On a Mac, I always put my database volumes as named volumes. I never bind mount them. I would never recommend. In fact, in most cases, that won't even work. A lot of cases, that won't work. It definitely won't work on Windows. But it's interesting that you have that experience. I don't have that experience. And I definitely would not enable any caching for that or anything like that. I would just let it use the pure file system inside the Linux machine. But I've not really had any performance problems with that. I'm assuming you're also on SSD, so it makes me look. Is there any difference in terms of stability for using Docker in enterprise between new AMD CPUs like EPYC and Intel? I've heard there were issues with Linux kernel compatibility issues. I can't tell you. I don't have a single customer using AMD in production like that. So, well, I'm sorry, not I was reading that as ARM. So you're saying ARM, Intel, and AMD? I've never heard of any. No, I've never heard of anything. I'm sure that there's things that exist, but they're super obscure. I don't have anybody telling me that they've had problem with AMD versus Intel. To me, that's a kernel issue, not a Docker issue. That's more about Linux kernels, not Docker. How can I list all the networks attached to a container from the Docker SDK? Well, from the command line, it's a Docker inspect. It shows you everything. I don't know how you do it from the API. But I'm sure it's just an API endpoint because that's what the Docker command line. The Docker command line is doing nothing but talking to the Docker API. So if you want to see how the Docker command line uses it, go. If you're a coder, it sounds like you are if you're using the SDK. Go look at the Docker command line Go language, and it's under, I think it's like github.com/docker/CLI maybe. You can see how the CLI goes and gets a Docker inspect command. Docker container inspect will tell you. It will give you metadata, basically JSON dump, and then you can just parse the JSON for the networks. Docker on MacBook comparing to Linux runs extremely slow when using bind mounting because of virtual machines. Are there any plans to make Docker on Mac faster or more native-like? I talked about that for 15 minutes in this show, so rewatch this show. Enya. Go rewatch this show. I answered that earlier about all the new features that you can use now and that even more is coming. It's on the Docker roadmap. So get on the Edge release, enable in the settings, you can enable a new feature and it will do that. Bret, any plans on adding sidecar or service mesh things to Kubernetes mastery course? Yes. I will mention sidecar. I mean, sidecar meaning just more containers in the pod. There are some things in there that are already in the slides. Service mesh is not in the slides. I would love to add it, but it's not going to be anytime this year. To me, service mesh is a separate course because service mesh is so complicated, and you can't talk about just one because they're all completely different in their implementation. and there's no clear winner. So it's a real challenge with service mesh. It's very advanced. There's a lot going on there. And so I will probably, if I do add it, it will be next year or later, and it will maybe be a separate course with maybe just 1 or 2 mentions of it inside of Kubernetes Mastery. So I guess sidecar, yes. Service mesh, no. Probably not. When you use Heroku, do you use PM2? I don't know what PM2 is, so I don't know. I mean, is that a Heroku feature? I'm not sure what you're talking about. Is it possible to create a Docker volume to point to a host file, not bind? I'm not sure what you're really getting at. Are you saying I want to add to a container when it starts manual host assignment? Because you can do that with the Docker run command. You can specifically add new DNS entries for that container inside of the Docker run command so that you're not touching the host file. Because the Docker container, Docker controls the host file, right? So you don't really want to mess with that. And Docker's, the way that you control the Docker DNS is by doing Docker run and adding DNS names. So you could have a whole list of new thing. You know, if you had a whole list of servers that you wanted to put into a container for resolution, you can do that. Although I do find that with Docker, people don't normally do that, because in order to change those, you then have to go redeploy the container, right? You have to stop that container, create a new container with a new Docker run command. So that's not very flexible. So I find that most people really, they're just using external DNS, and that if they need to leave, if the Docker container needs to leave the cluster to do some lookups, then it's just the next hop, wherever the next hop is, you know, whether it's their internal DNS or it's like Route 53 or something, they're just adding stuff into that. So, and then that way they can dynamically update without changing the container configuration, right? So I don't see that being used a lot. Oh, okay, so, sorry, PM2, kind of node super, yes. So I'm sorry, PM2, Forever, NodeMon, all those things. I don't in Heroku, but I could see why you'd want to. So yes, I could see, but I stopped using all those stuff. Once I started using containers, I stopped using PM2, Forever, NodeMon. There's no real need for it with containers, because containers, you're supposed to scale up with containers, not inside the container with multiple instances of node. So maybe if I was on Heroku and I was not using containers on Heroku, but I was using Heroku proc files for spinning up a native Heroku instance, I might consider PM2, yeah, or at least the built now. If you're on the latest nodes, right, there's some of the built-in parallelism stuff. So yeah, maybe. What's your opinion on Knative? Is it production ready or just cool thing to know? Knative versus like, well, Knative is a thing. You could do it production. I don't have, let's just say this, I have no one running it in production, so I would not be the best person to ask that. I think Knative is relatively new. I would probably, knowing Alex Ellis, who created the OpenFaaS project, I would probably go OpenFaaS, because you can actually pay him for support if you want. You can even hire him as a support for that solution, and it's been around longer and has a really vibrant community, OpenFaaS, OpenFaaS. So just because I know that better than I know Knative, I think it has more features than Knative, actually, if I remember correctly. I'm not sure. I had Alex Ellis on this show, so if you go to Bret.live and you look back for Alex Ellis at the beginning of this year, and we talk about OpenFaaS, and we actually address a little bit of that versus Knative and other things. So yeah, so go check that out. So I'm gonna say I don't know. I'm not really sure. Can you talk a bit about 12-factor and what promotes environments, however, more secure, or Docker secrets? Well, yeah, sure. Docker secrets are great. If you're on Swarm, then you would use Docker secrets. That's still, 12-factor. The goal of 12-factor is that you basically abstract the environment variables. You abstract things out of your apps. 12-factor is really old, right? It's still very correct. It's 100% correct. but it's over a decade old now. 12-factor was invented before the learnings that made Docker. So the idea with 12-factor, if you go into 12-factor and you look at their environment stuff, you will basically read that the important part of that is that you abstract out all environment settings so that nothing is hard-coded. You never want it to be hard-coded. At the time, the only consensus that we as a community could arrive at was environment variables as a common way that every app on every system everywhere would run. If nowadays you are running a container orchestrator, Swarm, Kubernetes, whatever, almost all those solutions have a way to deliver a secret or an encrypted file. In the case of Kubernetes, it can also do environment variables, but an encrypted file that could store your encrypted data. That to me is still 12-factor because it's abstracting the environment settings out of the app so that they are injected at runtime, not at build time. That's the key part of 12-factor. It's a great question, and I hope I answered it. What do you think about Podman? Will it replace Docker? No, and its goal is not to replace Docker. Docker does 10 times more than what Podman does. Podman is using the Linux and Unix goals of one tool for one job. So it will only really ever do one thing, and that is to run a container. Docker is all about making the tool easy. So it does a dozen things. It does the networks. It does Swarm. It does orchestration. It does encryption. It does config maps and secrets, and it does image management and image building. It's a builder. So to even get close to what Docker does, you would need to have at least 3 or more Red Hat tools. But a lot of sysadmins don't like Docker in the way that it's its own daemon, and it's large, meaning that it has a lot of functionality all in one tool. And they would rather have tool isolation. So they would rather have things like Podman, Image, Builda, Scopio, like all these tools that all do a subset of what Docker does. But in order to do that, now you have more tools you have to learn. Now you have to maintain the versions of all those tools. They still don't have all the same functionality as Docker because the Docker team puts so much work into Docker. So Red Hat's not trying to beat Docker in a way, right? They don't really compete. It's just different goals. So in the world of open source, we have different goals with tools. I really like Podman for if you're a person who's running Linux locally and you just want to simply spin up a container, but you don't want to run Docker full time, and you've already got systemd running, and so you just want to spin up a container with systemd. That's what Podman's great at. But Podman is not a server tool, really, because most of us are going to use orchestration. And Podman is not for orchestration. It is simply for running a single container or some containers on a single server, right? And it does great at that. It's got lots of features for that, but it can't build images, at least as last I checked. That was not its goal. That's what Builda is for. And Builda has its own syntax. And if you want to work with a registry, that's what Scopio is for. If you want to build images, I think IMG is also another great tool. If you just want to focus on daemonless building of images using BuildKit, that's a really cool tool. Or you can actually download BuildKit itself and run it separately. But Docker does all that combined in one tool. But yes, it normally has to run as root as a daemon. So that's not always perfect for every situation. So I think it's the right tool for the right job. I don't think that they will ever replace, Docker's certainly never going to adopt any of Red Hat's tools. There is a lot of history, by the way, between the two companies, and they don't necessarily always see eye to eye. But I think that's like old news. Like those people are gone. Those, whatever. We don't care about those people. And that fight, like those people are all left to other jobs. And I think more it's just about the right tool for the right job. And I think for most people working locally on their machine, Docker is the easy way to go. As long as you got the resources, Docker is super simple, and it has all the tooling right into one command line. Yeah. For example, Podman doesn't work on Windows or Mac, so you don't really have an option there. You really want to do Docker Desktop. So yeah, it's not trying to solve all the problems. Docker Desktop trying to be they're really different goals, right? Docker Desktop's trying to be the universal tool to automate and make it easier for developers to build and deploy apps. Like they have this huge ecosystem of tooling: Docker Compose, Build Kit, Docker Desktop, Docker Engine, Docker Command Line, all this new stuff, right? And Podman is just one tiny little tool that allows you to run systemd containers. It's really a tiny little tool. But it's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it, Christian. Glad you asked that. I would like to know your hints and tips to create MongoDB cluster for production using Kubernetes. I would say use Atlas. Don't do it yourself. Use Atlas. It's great. MongoDB's Atlas service. I have had multiple customers. They all run Atlas, which is a outsourced service from MongoDB, the company, and it makes it super easy. They run them in the cloud that you're already in, so it's super fast, and you don't have to worry about it. So I honestly, I don't remember the last time I had to spin up MongoDB for a real production solution, because my customers always use Atlas because they don't want to run it themselves. So I don't really have a good. I would say go look for a MongoDB operator. If you have to run it yourself, go look for an operator. Yeah. Sorry about asking the port questions with lots to unpack. No worries. It's just, I'm happy. I like the hard questions. They're a challenge. So don't worry about it. I'll let you know if I don't have a good answer. My concern is always with the ports exposed by K3 or Swarm, like for Raft or the Kube API. You said you wouldn't expose these ports. If I can use DigitalOcean without exposing the Kube API port, then it sounds like I just shouldn't use their service, and I shouldn't use K3s on servers without private networks or firewalls. Thanks for the info. But again, you're taking part of my statement. My part of my statement was without authentication, right? And so when you're using DigitalOcean's and they expose the API port, they're exposing it on a high port, as far as I remember, and they're exposing it using a certificate that they give you. So you're doing certificate authentication, which is one of the best forms of authentication against that API endpoint. So it's not an unencrypted or unauthenticated connection. You are encrypted over TLS. You are authenticated using certificate authentication. So it's not bad. That I myself run Kubernetes clusters on DigitalOcean using their Kubernetes because it's easy. It's simple. It's not unsafe. They would never, I don't think, I've met many of the people at DigitalOcean. I've toured their headquarters at DigitalOcean. I trust them to only deploy services that they provide to their customers in a secure manner. I am sure that there are some people that don't think that that's good enough and that they will want to do their own thing, but I fully believe that their API is protected well through a certificate. That's why they have a process for you to get that certificate to put in your kube config file. So hopefully 6 corners, that helps alleviate your fears. I was not suggesting. What my point was is that if you randomly just go deploy Kubernetes with kubeadmin, and even then, kubeadmin nowadays it uses certificate authentication by default out of the box, so it's nice and secure. But in the past, we've had lots of people just putting the API out there with no authentication, no encryption. But if you set both of those up, you need both encryption and authentication. And if you do both of those, and ideally on a high port that's not public, then I would consider that a relatively safe, because again, I put SSH on the internet all over the place, and it's using SSH key authentication, which is just relatively as safe as a PKI certificate, which is what you're doing, and as long as it's encrypted, and I also like to put it on a high port just because I hate reading through all the logs that are showing all the failed authentication attempts against my SSH and my HTTPS authentication. I get tired of looking at those logs. I don't want to do it. So I always put it on high ports just as an extra level of safety. But I trust SSH authentication with certificates. I trust TLS authentication with certificates. So I don't have a problem with that. If you know how to do that and you know that it's working well, like it does automatically out of the box with DigitalOcean, I would trust it. What do you think about apps that consume lots of memory like Java to run in containers? Is it worth to deploy, or should a container to change the language? Christian, that has nothing to do with containers. Containers can run 64 gigs of RAM in them. They're just normal apps running on the Linux host. The number of CPUs or the number of gigs of memory that they use has nothing to do with whether or not you should run in a container. I say 99% of the time, in almost every case, I don't see why you wouldn't run it in containers. Always run in containers. I'm a fan of containers for every app on a Linux server. It's going to make it easier, I think, in every situation. It does mean that you have to learn Docker and you have to learn Docker files. But with every team that I've worked with, I've never seen a team roll back containers and go back to not using containers, right? Every team I've seen adopt containers saw benefits from doing so. Once they fully implemented all the container tooling and they were developing containers, they're testing in containers, they're production in containers, regardless of the app, regardless of the language. I don't care whether it's C language, Java, .NET framework, like it doesn't matter. Once they've gone containers, they stay there. And then I'm going to leave this up to the last question because I've been going for 2.5 hours. Have you give a try to Pulumi? No, I have not had a chance to do it. So what do you think? Put it in chat. Let me know your thoughts. I have not had a chance. It's another one of those DevOps tools, I believe, right? Like for DevOps tools, as I just said earlier, there are no DevOps tools. And you saw me say that, right? It's another tool that tries to automate and help you with your infrastructure, right? If I remember correctly. I have not tried it. So let me know in the comments. All right, everyone. Here's the wrap up. This is what you need to remember while you're sticking around. Don't leave yet. Here's a couple of things. One is you want to obviously like and subscribe, YouTube, blah, blah, blah. That's Bret.live over there, right there. Go to Bret.live, like and subscribe. But the way you can really support me is to go over to my Patreon page. So patreon.com/BretFisher, or you can go to BretFisher.com and then find the Patreon link there. We have 2 membership packages, and I appreciate all of you. A lot of you support me there. We're about to hit 100 paid supporters, and many more of you follow me with that, because you can actually follow me there and get all my weekly updates, everything I'm creating every week. You don't have to pay to get that. You can just follow. You scroll down and you can follow. Right down here, there's a follow button. But next week, we are doing our monthly High Fivers Club for $5. You get to join our Zoom chat, and no trolling or I will forever ban you. But if you pay $5, you get invited to a Zoom group where we are serious DevOps professionals or people that are getting into DevOps and want to spend an hour chatting or listening to other DevOps people talking about what they're working on. It's basically a coffee chat. We're hanging out 1 hour every month, and it's been fun. We've been doing it 4 or 5 months, and we might get a dozen people. We might get 5 people. It just depends on the week. But we're doing that next week. So in order to do that, you get in and join, and then you can get access to the post with all the information on how to register, and you can join us. It's a lot of fun. And I will see you next week here on YouTube Live, Patreon. No, I'm not on Patreon for live streaming. I'm on Periscope, YouTube Live, and Twitch. So you take your pick. I'll be on all 3. And I will see you here next week. Thank you so much for all the questions, everyone. See you soon.